Okay, thanks, Peter, and good morning, everyone. And it's a real pleasure and honour to be asked to do this today. I think these courses are really valuable, and I know they've been running for quite some time and had some really good outcomes for the participants and for the system. So it's great to be a small part of that today, and I look forward to sharing with you a bit of. I guess it's not rocket science, but it's some of the things that I've found during my leadership journey that have really been useful, particularly in recent years when I've changed very much my approach to thinking about leadership and thinking about how to undergo significant change in a school. So very, very briefly, my background is I worked in a number of schools in my early career, including in Whyalla with Peter in my first appointment a long time ago. Worked in various parts of the country, spent some time in central office in what used to be called the staffing section. Spent a lot of time in leadership at Hallett Cove, an R12 school, and for the last, this is my 10th year, for the last 9 and a bit years I've been principal at Seaton High School, which is undergoing a significant change. And I'll touch on a bit of that today, but that's not really what it's about. I'm just going to talk through some of the things that have been really important to me in terms of my leadership of that process. So I've been asked to talk about the new learning paradigm and how leadership impacts on that. So I guess when I first started to think about that, I wanted to think about, okay, well, what do I value and what do I think is important in terms of the new teaching paradigm? And increasingly, my thoughts over recent years have come down to we need to undergo some significant changes if we are to give our young people what they truly need in terms of the education. So I think we need to do everything we can to move to, I should say, a post-industrial model of education. Now, we've all heard the history of how we ended up with an industrial education system where they decided around the time of the Industrial Revolution which subjects were important to the workforce, and largely we're still working with those packages of subjects. I don't think that's enough for the students that we have well into the 21st century. What I think is important is the notion of building the capabilities, the dispositions and the attitudes of students so they're able to function effectively no matter what they choose to do once they leave their school or their education careers and move out into workforce, further education, starting their own business, whatever that looks like. Now, I've just put this one up here, but there's many other representations of what capabilities are important to young people, or everyone for that matter, currently. This is one that we've developed as part of the Entrepreneurial Specialist Schools group, which Seaton is part of. And it looks at what are the entrepreneurial capabilities that are important to students, not just to start their own business, but to be successful in no matter what they do in life, whether it's being an employee, whether it's being a social entrepreneur, whether it's going on to further education. And it's around, and obviously you won't be able to read that, but that's not really why I put it up there. The three inner parts of that wheel, I think, are, the way I look at education now, it's about finding opportunity, learning by doing, and making it happen. So if we're going to create an environment where that's the way that we go about education in schools, I think there's some significant changes and some challenges for what we're doing, working with our people and working with our communities. So one of the things that really resonated with me is, and I think it really crystallised in my head when I heard Yong Zhao talk about it at a SASPA conference quite a number of years ago, when he described the fact that education, what we do is we spend all of our time getting students ready for things, but they never actually do it. We get them ready for the next thing, we get them ready for the next thing after that. We fill them up with this knowledge, but when do they actually ever use it? And then, that's you might need it one day syndrome. And I think we need to be looking at whether that's the way that we should be looking at education. Capabilities I've talked about, and I think we need to start our thinking in terms of our working with young people at what are the capabilities that we need the students to develop, and then think, okay, how does the content inform that? What content do we need to develop the capabilities of the students? And that's very much a flipping around of the way we've done it for, well, certainly all of my career. And the other thing that is become a real focus for us at Seaton is the notion of independent learning. I often am amazed when I hear teachers and leaders talk about all the really thoughtful and important things they're doing with their students. Almost invariably, it's them doing all the work. So we're doing a lot of work around developing students as independent learners. Students, it's a bit of a cliche, I know, but students who will take charge of their own learning. And that very much changes the paradigm of what we want our staff to be working on. Okay, so what's stopping us from doing all that? I think there's a number of factors. Probably the biggest factor is that all of us, even the youngest people in the room, are successful products of an industrial model of education ourselves. That's what we went through. Almost, I'm sure there are always exceptions. People have taken different pathways. But the vast majority of teachers and leaders were very successful products of a industrial model. So we have deep-seated ideas, habits, tendencies. Deep down, we're always thinking, is this the right way of doing things? Referencing it to the way that we were successful. And many of us can overcome that, and I'm sure many of you have in various ways, but think deep down that's a problem for us. We know, well, we think we know, that the way to be successful is a certain pathway. And that's what's worked for us, and that's, I think, inhibits a lot of our thinking from time to time. The other big factor in terms of what's stopping us moving on is that we work as part of a system which is entirely appropriate and even desirable, I think. So we're not self-employed, we're not subcontractors, we're part of that system. We have to do what the system expects us. And sometimes some of those things are not in alignment with the sort of approaches that I'm talking about. Doesn't mean they're not important, doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing them, but the problem is that they sometimes take up too much of our attention and overshadow the really important work. Okay, so 20 years into the 21st century, we've talked about 21st century teaching and learning for a long time now. And now, 21 years in, we shouldn't be talking about that anymore. I think we should be talking about current teaching and learning practices. So we haven't changed that much. When I look at what happens in schools, it's not, there's been some significant changes, obviously, but there's still a lot of practices that are in place that have been there for quite some time. And I'll point out this is not a blame conversation, or it's just an observation of where we're at. And as I said, there's a whole lot of reasons for that, I think. So what happens when we try to change? And I want to use this as an example, partly because it's something that we went through a number of years ago at Seaton, and it's informed, our response to it has informed a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm not going to do a group talk or anything. I just want you to spend 30 seconds thinking about, if you gave a group of teachers at your site a task of designing some integrated learning unit across 3 areas of Australian curriculum at Year 9 to go for a whole term, just think of the first couple of things that pop into your head about the very first thing that you think they would do or start to talk about. Okay, I think, and I've observed, that the first thing they want to do is they'd want to start writing a unit plan. And, I'm talking about committed, good quality teachers. They'd think, okay, how are we going to do this? And they'd jump in and they'd start writing a unit plan. What's this going to look like? And it wouldn't take long before they started to think, okay, what content do we have to cover? Fair questions. And then they'd start asking some other questions. And depending on the group, these would come early or a bit later on. How are we going to cover it all? What about NAP plan? Are they going to get what they need for senior school? Is each subject getting enough minutes? the sort of details that bog people's thinking down in terms of allowing themselves to look at things a little bit differently. Now, in terms of looking at those in isolation, there's nothing wrong with any of those questions or any of that thinking. But if you think like that and you approach it like that, you're not going to do something, I believe you're not going to do something that approaches what I'm talking about in terms of focusing on the capabilities. Straight away, you'll be talking about what content do we need to pour into the students' heads. So what's happening? Part of it is those deep-seated niggling doubts that we have about, okay, we know to be successful you need to get an ATAR at year 12 because that's what we did. Okay, we need to make sure we're not undermining that. Again, that's a valid thing to do, but I don't believe it should be the principal thing that we're thinking about. So I wanted to use something, and I apologise, I don't know the original, someone else might, origin of the Butler model. You can Google it, but it's something that I came across a number of years ago at a conference, and I found it a really useful tool in thinking about how we can challenge our thinking and our staff's thinking in terms of approaching tasks like the one I was just talking about. So what it does, it talks about whenever you're reflecting or generating new ideas, the first thing that we always do is to go inside ourselves. We think about, okay, what is my own personal practical knowledge in this area? What do I know about developing an integrated group of subjects? What do I know about those individual subjects? What do I know that I've done in the past? And then we start thinking, what are our mental models about that? What is my experience in the past informed in terms of the way I think about these sorts of things? You know, what do I know works, what doesn't work? And straight away, when we stay in there, we are very limited in terms of the thinking that we will allow ourselves to have when we progress. The person that I first heard talk about this was a person by the name of Neil Carrington, who you can, if you Google him or you check him on YouTube, you'll see a few of his presentations, and he's a really good presenter, and he talked about this model the first time when I saw it, and what he said is that we stay in that side of this model most of the time, and as he put it, in there, we're a bloody genius and we're never ever wrong, because that's what we know, and that's what we've experienced, and we know that whatever we do, we know the answers, and that's what's going to happen. And he argues, and this model argues, that what we need to do is to get out of our own heads, get out of ourselves, and think about the other side of this model, outside of us. So what is the public information out there? What does the research tell us? Now, one of the problems I think with us as a profession is that we are not, unlike many other professions, in most cases, we don't have a tradition of really looking at current research or even older research. Today's a good example of the opposite of that. But I think in all of our work in schools, we need to be more open to saying, what does the research tell us about these things? You know, what does the public information about what it does and doesn't work, and what is the best practice in these places, in these situations? What's actually out there? And what is current practice elsewhere that's being really effective, that might challenge our own mental models and our own personal practical knowledge? So the notion of the Butler model, and we reference this a lot at school, whenever we start to talk about something at Seaton, we talk about, okay, let's make sure we get over to the left of the Butler model and don't immediately leap to the conclusions that we know, we've tried this, didn't work in the past, it's not going to work this time, let's just do what we've always done. And I think that's a really important approach, and that model has been really valuable. It's certainly one of the things in terms of my career as a leader that really changed and challenged my thinking. I think in my early career, I spent a lot of time on the right-hand side there, where I knew what things had worked and what hadn't, and I was often sceptical of things that I hadn't seen work or that I hadn't thought of, to be perfectly honest. And I think we need to challenge ourselves in that space. Okay, so what sort of leadership do we need to overcome this? Because just telling people that isn't going to make a difference. We need to work around, structure things and lead in ways that's going to challenge people's thinking and challenge them to think about getting to the left-hand side of the Butler model and getting out of their own heads. So whenever we work, well, in fact, before we do any work in any change process or in any area, we need to work on our own thinking first. We need to make sure, if we're talking about, for example, we've had done a lot of work on creative thinking, and I would bet that creative thinking is somewhere in the plans of many schools in terms of developing it in our students, critical and creative thinking. It's been one of the things that's in the top 40 for a long time. The question is, how many of us are actually creative thinkers ourselves? And if we're not creative thinkers, how do we expect to be able to work with our leaders? And then how do we expect our leaders and our teachers to work with students to become creative thinkers if they're not in that space themselves? So we need to constantly develop our own work, and we've done a lot of work in that space around developing the staff thinking. All of our professional development programs are around not learning how to do stuff, it's learning how to change our thinking. In all change processes, I think it's absolutely critical that the first thing you do is you start with the staff and their thinking. So when going back to that example I used of the integrated unit, it's no good just saying to them, we're going to develop an integrated unit because we think it's a really important thing to do in terms of developing the students' capabilities. You need to say, okay, what do we think about this problem? What are our biases? What are our thoughts? How are we going to change our thinking so we don't immediately leap to those questions that I was talking about before, and we give it some real consideration in terms of how we're going to develop this so it becomes valuable to the students. This is a quote from a book. I've got a reference to this later, and I can leave it with Peter anyway, by Matthew E. May. It's called Winning the Brain Game, Fixing 7 Fatal Flaws of Thinking. Highly recommend it. It's a really good book. He talks about developing the elegant solution to problems. And his, I guess, mantra is what appears to be the problem isn't, what appears to be the solution isn't, and what appears to be impossible isn't. And I guess that's a way of challenging our thinking before we start something, not to start with saying we can and can't do things and these things are and aren't possible. I'm going to give an example of the process that we've gone through, a more extensive process, and what this has looked like. We've developed our Year 7 and 8 curriculum model, which I'm not going to talk about at length here because it's not the right forum, but I want to talk about some key elements of it and what we've done to work through processes to challenge people's thinking before we've even got to the point of starting to do the unit plans. So that's what our Year 7 and 8 curriculum model looks like, and I'm clearly not going to go through the whole thing. How are we going with this? Working? Yes, it's a bit faint. Basically, you can see that the way we've organised our curriculum is not in terms of subject areas, but we're developing thinking around subject nodes, not subject nodes, learning nodes. And in those nodes, we have groups of students working with groups of teachers on authentic problems and authentic learning, much like the integrated model that I was talking about before. So the arts one, for example, rather than having our Year 7s and 8s all doing a bit of drama, a bit of music, a bit of art, dance, the traditional sorts of things, and then so they do a term of each or half a semester of each or a bit of this, a bit of, and then gradually decide what they really want to do. We're developing learning around a notion of you can be in a group of students with a group of teachers, and you can work with the teachers, and the teachers will work with you around a significant and authentic outcome and design the learning with your input as a student around what that will look like. And it will cover all of the Australian curriculum. It will give them a basis in terms of the capabilities that they'll need to progress into those subjects in later years, but it won't be prescribed and it won't be developed on the basis of the content first. So, working with teachers on that is a bit of a challenge because they will understandably jump to those sorts of questions that I mentioned before. So we started this not with the teachers, but we did a lot of work with our curriculum leaders, our Band B curriculum leaders. We have a Band B leader of each curriculum area, or a Band B2 in some cases for multiple areas. And we did a lot of work about changing their thinking, opening up their thinking to using the Butler model approach to alternative ways of looking at the curriculum. so that they didn't get bogged down in those questions about, well, hang on a minute, that means I'm going to get less time for my subject. Or what's that going to mean for my dance classes at year 11 and 12? So we've done a lot of work with them before we even talked about what the learning was going to look like. Then and that's a very quick description of what took a long time, and it's quite a complicated process that we could share with people at some other time if they're interested. But the next step was, okay, if we're going to now take this out to work with our staff, how are we going to approach that? Because we don't want the leaders to experience exactly what we would have experienced with the leaders if we just told them to do it. So we had a process of getting people to express interest in becoming writers for this curriculum model. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a full-day program with 25 of our staff on a day on calibrating their thinking around what they were going to do when they started to write these units of work. So they didn't talk about the content, they didn't talk about minutes, they didn't talk about the things that I was mentioning in those questions before. They talked about what does our thinking need to be so that we can develop learning focusing on the capabilities, bringing in the content, sure, making sure they've got what they need for future years, sure, but starting with an entirely different approach. That was a whole day program just on their thinking. And that's it's not a magic bullet. We've still got some people in there that are a little bit like this about, oh, I'm not so sure, but most of them have made a bit of a leap and are thinking around, okay, how can we work together to make this look significantly different? So now they're working in teams with the support of their leader to work through that writing process for next year. Okay, so the other thing that I mentioned about what's stopping us from progressing is the system. And I'm going to use an analogy here, and again, I don't know of who to reference in this one. I'm going to give credit to my deputy, Jane Hernandez, who is the first person I heard mention this analogy. I think it's a really good one, and talks about the notion of that we work in an area of paddocks and fences. So we have a fence around what we're able to do in schools, which is put there by a variety of things like the system constraints, the things that we have to do as part of being part of the government system, the things we have to do because we need to allow students to be successful in their SASPA certificate, the things that we have to do in terms of making sure that we get reasonable results in that plan, so we don't get questions asked about what we're doing at the school and how we're letting our kids down. There's a whole lot of constraints, and that's the fence around the paddock that we work in. This analogy talks about we spend a lot of time standing up against that fence looking straight at it. Whereas if we turned around and started wandering around, there's a lot of room to work in that paddock that we've got. We can come up with lots of innovative things inside the constraints that we find ourselves in as individual professionals and as schools. And it's a really useful analogy when people start to question things, oh, we can't do that, that'll never work, oh, no, that's not going to work, SASPA won't allow us to do that. The answer is, well, okay, are you standing there looking at the fence? Do you need to take a step back? Do you need to think about is what does SASPA really allow us to do or not allow us to do? And we found in that particular example, there's a lot of room that we're not using in our paddocks. And I think that's one of the advantages we have certainly in the South Australian system, because I think it's probably fair to say that the paddock that we work in is a little bit bigger than it is in many other systems around the state, around the country and around the world certainly. And that allows us, I think, to change that focus away from the industrial model to a post-industrial model, if we use it wisely and if we challenge our own thinking. I'll give you an example of what that looks like at Seaton. We've developed, over the last 4 years, a series of entrepreneurial SASPA packages. So this year, we've got a new timetable structure that means that on every Wednesday, over 200 of our 10 to 12 students are working in vertically grouped classes, although not really classes, vertical groups, years 10 to 12, on a theme based around a package of, say, subjects that has been developed not by we're going to do these subjects, but by we're going to look at this area of interest or this area of development, and what subjects can we use to package around that to make some really good learning. And the one that we've been doing for longest, we're doing 9 of them this year. The very first one of those we started 4 years ago was based around the UAV or drones. And the genesis of this was a leader came to me and said, I've got a great idea. I'd really like to do some work with drones, and I'd like to structure it in a way that we're getting the students their remote pilot's license, because I think that could be really useful for them. They could, that would be a really useful qualification to have, because we've done all this research about these are the jobs of the future, lots of jobs in the aeronautical area, and I could have very easily said, yeah, we could do that. Or sticking on the the right side of Butler. Yeah, I've seen things like that happen before, but they don't work very well. We're not going to put many resources into that. But we had a good look at it, and originally we were going to package it in the vet space. That became impossible, so I thought, okay, what are we going to do? So we thought, okay, we could look at this thing which we think is really important and useful. What SASE subjects could we package around this that would allow the students to have some really authentic learning and get SASE credit and get an industry standard qualification? And around it we put stage 2 design and engineering and stage 1 scientific studies. So 1 day a week for the whole year, these students worked on a range of projects. In the first couple of years it was looking at weed eradication on Kangaroo Island. So they developed the software models to map terrain, to develop a 3D model of the terrain, to recognise weeds, and then to make a deployment device to attach to the drones to autonomously drop weed herbicide on those weeds. So they went to Kangaroo Island, they looked at this, and they talked to real people, they looked at the real problems, and they developed a solution to it. And while they were doing that, they got stage 2 design and technology, stage 1 scientific studies, and their remote pilot's license and their radio operator certificate. So that was around starting with something authentic and packaging the learning around that. So that's a model that we've extended to now 9 other areas in things like social entrepreneurism. We had a food futures course producing food for homeless people. They're working with Forage Food Co, who do a lot of work in that space and sell food and from a food truck at WOMAD and things like that. We've got a course based around sports industry pathways. We had a lot of students who are really interested in sport, but recognise that most people aren't going to be professional athletes. However, there's lots of work in that space. So what can we package around PE and some integrated learning that gives them access to a whole range of different careers in sport? So that was a different approach, and that's allowed us to do some really different thinking about how we package learning, starting from an authentic problem. And again, that was working with a group of staff to challenge their thinking first. And in fact, it challenged the whole school so much that we changed our timetable to accommodate it. Initially, this was happening at the same time as other subjects. So the students were getting the pull from their teachers saying, oh, no, you can't go to that course today because I've got we're doing a physics test. You need to be here. Or you're missing too much content, those sorts of things. So we challenged our model around that sort of thinking, because this is no less important than that, and in fact, in some ways more important. So, a fundamental requirement of all of this in terms of leadership, if we're going to be innovative, if we're going to make sure that we challenge the industrial paradigm of learning, is, and I do know the source of this quote, Paul Keating described Peter Costello once famously as, I think he said, poor Costello, he's all tip and no iceberg. It's a good comment, because I think what it shows is you have to make sure that you've got the clear foundation in a school that allows these conversations to happen and allows the sort of risk-taking, because it is risky to a certain extent, to allow the risk-taking to happen to develop and to progress these sorts of approaches, because it is difficult and there is a lot of suspicion and wariness around, okay, if we're doing these sorts of things, how do we know we're not going to make it, stuff up these kids' futures because they're not going to get a good ATAR? There's some, for example, there are some legitimate concerns that you have to make sure that you have the ability to work with your group, with your communities to work through all those concerns. And just as a bit of an aside, we found that approach has dramatically improved the results in those subjects that are integrated in those packages, to the extent that we've had Year 10 students getting merits in Year 12 subjects, and our A's and B grades are way above average in the rest of our Year 12 and 11 subjects, and certainly above state as well. So the experience hasn't been that, but people were wary before we got to that point. So we need to have this really solid foundation around to allow us to do that. We need an absolute clarity of purpose. People need to know what you believe in, why we're doing this. It's not about experimenting on the kids. It's not because it's going to be more fun. It's because this is what we think is more valuable for the students. And I truly believe that if we don't focus on capabilities for our students, we're actually letting them down. We need to make sure our schools are well organised. Sounds obvious, but unless we're well organised, we get the management stuff right, we're not going to have the foundation where we can have these conversations. Sound management, effective systems. The school needs to be operating really well. So again, nice, calm, solid base so that we can be working on the things that are really important. Clear processes. We don't want people guessing about what's going to happen. They need to know the things that are coming. They need to know what to expect. And I guess summed up well by that quote. My research is not very good because I don't know the source of that quote either, but it's a good one. Managers solve current problems, leaders solve future problems. So we've got sound management in our schools, that solves all the current problems of the day-to-day school. As leaders, when we drop into the leadership aspect of our roles, which we all have, we're solving future problems. You have to have both of those. Clearly you can't have one without the other, and it's about getting the balance right. How am I going for time? I just wanted to finish with a couple of random tips that I've found useful in this sort of approach and in terms of leadership in general. Start with the willing. You probably heard that before, but it's absolutely critical. With those rolling out of those packages I was talking about, we started with a small group who were really keen. Once they experienced success, that pulled in some other people that were keen as well because they saw how good it was. And gradually it overcame some resistance to the point where I think as close as we'll ever get, we've got the vast majority of staff on board with this way of thinking in terms of those packages now. We don't get any, or very rarely do we get any, what about, or that means they're not going to get this, or those sorts of things, because we have the evidence to refute that, but we've also got the experience. That's largely because this group of people who are so passionate about it, it's been infectious. As a leader, I think it's absolutely critical to have a diverse team. As soon as you get the opportunity to start picking your own leaders in your own leadership team, make sure you don't pick people that are the image of yourself. Pick people that think differently, will challenge your thinking, but will also be part of the team. And that diversity is really critical. Military quote, again, it's probably a general one. I don't know the original source. Assumptions are the mother of all. We make a lot of assumptions, and again, one of the fatal flaws of thinking in that book that I referenced earlier is leaping. We do a lot of leaping. As soon as we hear something, we just leap to a conclusion straight away, often based on assumptions. This one's mine. I'm going to claim this. The one staff note syndrome. It's a leader that I have a lot of time for and I worked with in the past, was a little bit prone to, after conversation, we need to do whatever it was, his approach was, okay, I'll put a staff note in. And with the best of intentions, that's all that ever happened. And the assumption was, people will read that, they'll do it, and everything will be good. And if that was true, it probably would have been good, but it never happens. So you need to make sure the processes underlying whatever it is that you're doing are there to make sure you're reinforcing those things all the time. Neil Carrington is fond of saying this, and he challenges people to perform a bit of an experiment. Every time you find yourself about to say, I don't have time for that, substitute, maybe internally, not saying it, but substitute internally, that's not important to me. And it really does challenge some of your thinking. Again, you wouldn't want to say that all the time. It might be a bit challenging for the people that hear it. So, how often do we hear or say, I don't have time for that? And it might be that it's not important to me, or it might be that it's not important to me right now, but we need to make judgments around those sorts of things. And I'm going to finish with a couple of recommendations. The one, have a look at that. I do have a short version of it, but I have to check the copyright of it before I distribute. I'm happy to share it, or you might be familiar with it, Jane or Peter, I don't know. It's something that we found really useful in terms of challenging the thinking of staff. And if you haven't watched a video John Cleese did, it's quite a while ago now, I think it was actually back in the 90s, around creativity and management. If you just go to YouTube and search for John Cleese on creativity and management, you'll find that. It's really insightful in terms of the sorts of things I've been talking about in terms of challenging our thinking. Getting to the left side of the Butler model and some of the behaviours that we need to work on to progress. So as I said, I don't think there's anything revolutionary in that. It's just really a bit of a description of how we've managed to get to a point where we're now doing some fairly innovative approaches at Seaton, which I'm really confident will be successful in terms of giving the students the sorts of education that they need. It's not entirely a post-industrial. We still have classes, we still have ordinary subjects, and at the moment that's entirely appropriate, and it might always be appropriate, but at least we're starting to look at some other ways of addressing learning from a different approach. But most importantly, it's around changing our own thinking so that when we're working on that, we're committed to it, we truly believe in it, and we're open to that sort of change. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you.